The morning my daughter walked into my kitchen expecting forgiveness, she was wearing my husband's old cardigan. The gray one with the fraying cuffs she'd borrowed months ago and never returned. She came down the stairs in it like she owned the house, which I suppose she'd started to believe she did. She saw the table, my good china, the linen cloth I'd pressed the night before, the shortbread still warm on the plate, and she gave me that slow, crooked smile, the one that meant she'd already decided everything was fine. She hadn't seen who was sitting in the chair beside me. Let me go back to the beginning so you understand how we got here. My name is Edith. I'm 67 years old, and I live in the same house I've lived in for 34 years, a red brick semi-detached on a quiet street in Kingston, Ontario, close enough to the water that in summer you can smell the lake if the wind comes from the right direction. My husband and I bought it when our daughter was still in a stroller. He passed 11 years ago. A stroke, very sudden, very cruel, and since then it's been just me and the house and the garden and the routines that keep a person steady when the world goes quiet. I taught grade 4 for 26 years at a school 3 blocks away. I know half the adults in this neighborhood from when they were 8 years old. I am not a woman who frightens easily, and I am not a woman who asks for help unless I have no other choice. My daughter is 38. She studied accounting at Queen's. Right here in Kingston, close enough that she came home for Sunday dinners all 4 years, and I was so proud of her I could have burst. She married a man from Brockville when she was 29, and they had a little girl, my granddaughter, who turned 5 last April. For a long time, my daughter's life looked exactly like what I'd hoped for her. Then her marriage ended. There were reasons, and they were real, and I won't pick through them here. What I'll say is that when she called me 18 months ago, crying so hard I could barely understand her, asking if she and my granddaughter could come stay with me just for a bit, I said yes before she finished the sentence. It was good at first. My granddaughter's boots by the door, her drawings on the fridge, my daughter and I cooking together in the evenings, talking the way we used to when she was in university. I thought, this is a gift. 2 women putting a life back together, side by side. I should tell you when I first felt something shift. It wasn't dramatic. It never is, not at the beginning. It started with money. She asked to borrow $200 in November. Her half of the cell phone bill, she said. I gave it without thinking twice. The next month it was $500. Something about car insurance, a gap between payments. I gave that too. I'm her mother. My pension from the school board and my Canada pension plan aren't extravagant, but I've been careful my whole life, and I had savings. I thought I was helping her get back on her feet. By January, I noticed my Canadian Tire MasterCard had charges on it I didn't recognize. A grocery run on a Tuesday, I'd been home sick in bed, gas twice, at a station on the other side of town. When I mentioned it to my daughter gently, she said she'd forgotten to ask. She'd pay me back. She'd been rushed. Her tone was the first warning, not apologetic, impatient, like I was the one being unreasonable. I let it go. I should not have let it go. The e-transfers started in March. Small ones at first, $30, $50, from my TD account to a number I didn't recognize. When I finally went into the branch and asked a teller to print my transaction history, I sat in that little chair across from the wicket and felt the blood leave my face. Over 4 months, just over $4,200 had left my account in transfers I had not authorized. I confronted her that evening. I was calm. I'm a primary school teacher. I know how to keep my voice level when everything in me wants to break, and I laid the printouts on the kitchen table and said quietly that I needed to understand what had happened. What happened was that she stood up from the table, walked to the counter, and turned her back to me. She said the money was a loan. She said she'd meant to tell me. She said I didn't understand what it was like, trying to restart your life with a child and no real income, in Ontario, with rents the way they were. She said things had been hard. And then she turned around and looked at me and said, "You have more than enough, Mum. You always have." I remember the feeling of those words. Not anger, not right away. Something colder than anger. The feeling of recognizing very clearly that you have been mistaken about something important. I put the printouts in my filing cabinet and said we'd talk about it more when we were both calmer. We never did, because she never gave me the chance to bring it up again without it turning into something I didn't want my granddaughter to hear from upstairs. The few times I tried, she talked over me, or left the room, or started crying in a way that made me feel I was the one causing harm. I learned to go quiet. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself things would improve. I was still telling myself that the night I found the RRSP withdrawal slip. It was a Tuesday. My daughter had taken my granddaughter to swimming lessons, and I was sorting some papers when I opened the drawer of the secretary desk in the hallway. The old maple one that was my mother's, and there it was, a withdrawal confirmation from my bank. Dated 3 weeks earlier, $8,000 from my registered retirement savings plan, with the penalty deductions on top. I sat down on the floor of the hallway. I didn't mean to. My legs simply stopped working. I don't know how long I sat there, long enough that the light changed. When I heard her car in the driveway, I was still on the floor. I got up. I put the slip in my cardigan pocket. I helped my granddaughter out of her boots and her snowsuit. I gave her a glass of apple juice and set her in front of her show in the living room. And then I went to the kitchen where my daughter was making tea, and I placed the slip on the counter in front of her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said she'd meant to tell me. Same words as before, different crime. I said, "That's my retirement. That was the money I was going to live on." She turned around and her face had changed. She wasn't sorry. She was furious. The kind of furious that has been building for a long time and was finally choosing a direction. And she said I was acting like she was a stranger. She said I had no idea the pressure she was under, the debt she'd accumulated, the fact that her ex-husband had stopped his support payments. She said I was sitting in a paid-off house on a pension and a government check while she was drowning. I said, "You took that money without asking me." She shoved me. It wasn't a push. It was both hands hard flat on my shoulders. I went back into the counter. The edge of the laminate caught my right wrist as I fell, and I heard something I will not forget, a sound like a branch snapping in ice, a sharp crack inside my own arm. I was on the floor. My wrist was already swelling. She stood there. Her breathing was fast. Then she walked out of the kitchen and went upstairs without saying a word. I could hear the television in the living room. My granddaughter hadn't heard anything. She was watching her show. I sat on the kitchen floor for a while, long enough to understand that this was the end of something, and that the end had arrived, and that there was no point in pretending otherwise. I got up. I wrapped my wrist in the tea towel. Already it was twice its normal size, tender to the touch, and I put on my coat and my boots and I drove myself to the urgent care clinic on Princess Street. The woman at the desk asked what happened. I said I slipped in the kitchen. They x-rayed it, said it was a hairline fracture, fitted me with a splint, told me to follow up with my GP. I drove home. It was just past 11 o'clock. The house was dark except for the light in my daughter's room. I didn't go to bed. I went to the kitchen and turned on the radio. CBC Radio 1, low, the way I always have it, and I stood at the counter for a long time looking at my splinted wrist under the overhead light. Then I got out the sequel and the flour and the cold butter. I bake when I need to think clearly. It's something my own mother taught me, not deliberately, just by doing it. Her hands always knew what to do when her mind was too full. That night, mine did too. I made shortbread, 4 dozen pieces, cut with the little round cutter my daughter had given me as a Christmas gift 4 years ago, which I am aware is a painful kind of irony. While they baked, I made the calls. The first was to Lois. Lois has lived next door for 29 years. Her husband and mine used to argue amiably about the Leafs every winter, 2 men on adjacent driveways, breath fogging in the cold air. When my husband died, Lois was the one who sat with me in the kitchen the night of the funeral, after everyone else had gone home. Before she retired, she was a justice of the Ontario Court of Justice, Family Division, for 16 years. She has seen every version of damage a family can do to itself. She is 73, she is immovable, and she is the wisest person I know. She picked up on the second ring. "Edith," she said, no greeting, she knew. I told her everything, the transfers, the credit card, the RRSP, the shove, my wrist. My voice was steady. I decided on the drive home from the clinic that my voice was going to stay steady for everything that came next. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll come for breakfast, 8 o'clock. I said, "Yes, please." She understood what I was asking without my having to explain it. That's the thing about a woman who spent 16 years in a courtroom. She knows the difference between a meal and a reckoning. The second call was to Constable Webb. He's a community liaison officer with Kingston Police. He volunteers at the senior center where I run the Thursday morning reading group, and we've known each other for 3 years. He is methodical and decent. And when I told him what had happened, including the wrist, including the $8,000, he was quiet in the way that a person goes quiet when they are already thinking through next steps. I told him I didn't want a squad car at midnight. I told him I wanted to do this with some dignity. I needed him at my house at 8 in the morning. He said, "Mrs. Edith, that's not exactly protocol." I said, "I know, and I'm asking you anyway." He said he'd be there. The third call was to my sister in Ottawa. She answered on the first ring the way she always does when she sees my number after 10 at night. I told her everything. She cried. I didn't. When I was done, she said, "I'm coming." I said, "The 401 at this hour." "I'm coming," she said again, and that was the end of that. I finished the shortbread. I arranged it on my good china plate. I laid the linen tablecloth, white, slightly yellowed at the edges, my mother's, over the dining room table. I set 4 places. I thought about who would be sitting where. I thought about my granddaughter asleep upstairs in the room that used to be the sewing room. And I made myself stop thinking about it. Because there was no way to think about it that didn't pull me under. At 4 in the morning, I sat in the armchair by the front window and watched the snow come down. Light, fine snow, the kind Kingston gets in February that barely accumulates but makes the night look soft and impossible. My wrist ached inside its splint. The CBC late-night programming murmured from the kitchen radio. I didn't sleep. My sister arrived at 6:10. She rang the bell softly. I let her in and she looked at my wrist and then at my face, and then she held me for a long moment without saying anything. Then she went and put the kettle on. At 7:45, I went upstairs. Not to my daughter's room, to my granddaughter's room. I stood in the doorway and watched her sleep, this small person with her arm wrapped around a stuffed seal, her mouth slightly open. I had known since about 3 in the morning what was going to happen today, and it was the one thing I had not let myself think about directly, because it was the only thing that had come close to breaking me. I went back downstairs. At 8 o'clock exactly, the doorbell rang. Lois was on the step in her good coat, the dark navy one she wore to court, the one she's kept because she says good coats don't go out of style. Constable Webb was beside her in uniform, his cap in his hand. He'd brought a colleague, a young officer, who stood quietly at the edge of the step. Lois looked at my wrist in the splint. Her expression didn't change, but I saw what moved behind her eyes, and I was grateful for her discipline. She said, "Good morning, Edith." I said, "Come in, the tea is on." We moved into the dining room. The table looked the way I'd intended, precise, calm, hospitable, in a way that had nothing to do with hospitality. 4 cups, the shortbread. A pot of tea under the cozy my granddaughter had picked out at the craft sale last autumn, orange with white daisies. We heard the footsteps overhead about 10 minutes later. My daughter's room, the hall, the stairs. She came down in my husband's gray cardigan and her pajama pants, hair loose, and she stopped in the doorway of the dining room and blinked at the table. She saw me. She saw my sister. She registered them with some confusion. Perhaps she thought there'd been a family emergency. Perhaps she thought I'd called my sister to mediate. She gave me that slow smile, the one that said, "You've forgiven me. Of course you have." "Morning," she said, and reached for the teapot. Constable Webb stepped from behind the door. I watched her face. I will carry that moment for the rest of my life, the exact sequence of it. The smile went first, then the color, then the composure. Her hand stopped in midair above the teapot. Her eyes moved from the constable to his colleague to Lois, who was sitting at the far end of the table in the chair that used to be my husband's, hands folded in her lap, watching my daughter with the patient, relentless attention of someone who has done this for a very long time. My daughter set the teapot down slowly. "Mum," she said. Her voice had changed entirely. "What is this?" It wasn't a question. It was the beginning of a negotiation she thought she could still win. Lois spoke before I could. She spoke in the quiet, careful way she has. Not unkind, not performative. Simply the voice of someone who has spent 2 decades sorting fact from feeling and knows exactly how to lay one beside the other. "I've known your mother since you were in primary school," she said. I've watched you grow up from across the fence. I know the girl you were." She paused. "I also know what your mother's TD bank statement says. I know what a hairline wrist fracture looks like. And I know that the proper name for what has happened in this house is financial abuse followed by assault." My daughter opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," Lois said without raising her voice at all. My daughter closed her mouth. Constable Webb explained the situation, that a complaint had been filed, that there were grounds for charges under the criminal code, that there was a documented pattern of financial exploitation and a documented injury. He told her she had the right to contact a lawyer. He mentioned that Legal Aid Ontario was available to her. He was not unkind, he was clear. My daughter began to cry, all at once, like a pipe that's held too long finally letting go. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't meant for things to go this far. She said the money had felt like a loan in her mind. She'd always intended to pay it back. She didn't know why. She hadn't said anything. She'd been so ashamed. She'd been so frightened. She'd been so overwhelmed. I believed the fear. I believed the shame. Those parts I recognized. They were not enough. I stood up. "I know you were frightened," I said. "I know things fell apart in ways that weren't entirely your fault. I know how hard this year has been." I held her eyes. "And none of that is why you're here this morning. You're here because you took $4,200 from my bank account without asking. You took $8,000 from my retirement fund. And when I put a piece of paper on the counter and asked you to explain it, you pushed me into the edge of the counter and fractured my wrist." She shook her head. "Mum, I'm not asking you to agree with me," I said. "I'm telling you what happened." She was crying steadily now. She said she'd leave immediately. She and my granddaughter, she'd find somewhere else to go. She wouldn't put me through any more of this. "One more chance," she said. She just needed one more chance. I thought of the 11 months before that last night. The way I'd learned to read the weather in her face before I walked into a room. The way I'd stopped having friends over because I never knew what state the house would be in. The way I'd opened a second account she didn't know about so that my grocery money would be safe. The way I'd started sleeping with my bedroom door locked. "I have given you chance after chance," I said, "and I am your mother, and that is not going to stop. But I am also 67 years old, and this is my house, and I have been afraid in my own kitchen. That is where we are." Constable Webb stepped forward. He told her she'd need to come with him, that there were procedures, that she had rights, and he'd explain them properly. He was gentle about it. My daughter looked at me one last time from the doorway. Her face was unrecognizable. "What about?" she started. "My granddaughter is safe," I said. "That's what matters." A children's aid worker arrived 40 minutes later. I had known that call was coming. I'd made a kind of peace with it overnight, or as much peace as a person can make with watching their 5-year-old granddaughter be led out the door by a stranger, even a kind one. I held my granddaughter for a long time and told her that Grandma loved her and that she was going to be okay and that I would see her very soon. Both of those things were true. Both of them are still true today. The house was very quiet after they left. My sister made fresh tea. Lois stayed for an hour, drinking it with us at the table that still had the good china on it, and we talked about ordinary things. Her garden plans, a book she'd been reading, whether the snow was going to amount to anything. The ordinary business of getting through the first hour of a new life. In the weeks that followed, I changed the passwords on every account. I had the locks rekeyed. I met with a financial advisor and began understanding what it would take to rebuild what I'd lost. It would take time, but it was not impossible. I found a therapist, a woman who works with older adults in the Rideau Street neighborhood, and I went every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and I talked until there was nothing left to hold back. My daughter was charged. She entered a guilty plea and received a conditional discharge. Court-ordered repayment on a schedule, mandatory financial counseling, no unsupervised contact with me for 6 months. The letter arrived about 3 weeks after her hearing. Plain white envelope. Her handwriting, the same round careful printing I'd watched her practice at the kitchen table when she was 7 years old. She wrote that she had not understood until she was sitting in a lawyer's office with a court date how far she had traveled from the person she meant to be. She wrote that she had been angry at her circumstances for years and had aimed that anger at the nearest available target, me. because I had always absorbed it without consequence. She wrote that she was ashamed. She did not ask me to forgive her. She said she understood if I never did. She asked only if she could call my granddaughter. I wrote back. I said, supervised, scheduled, 15 minutes, a time I would choose. I said I needed more time before I could think about the rest. We are in the more time now. It is slow going. My daughter calls on Wednesday evenings, 15 minutes as agreed. She sounds different. Whether that difference is permanent or temporary, I am watching to find out. I am not an unwilling witness, but I am no longer a forgiving one by default, and those are not the same thing. My granddaughter comes to visit on Saturday afternoons. We bake shortbread together. She stands on her step stool and cuts the circles with great seriousness, the tip of her tongue between her teeth. Those hours are the purest thing in my life right now. Lois told me, the week after everything happened, that the cruelest lie we tell ourselves as mothers is that love must be unconditional or it isn't love at all. She said, unconditional love is a feeling, unconditional access is a policy, and policies can be changed. I have been thinking about that ever since. My name is Edith. I am 67 years old. I live in my own house, on my own terms, in a city by a lake that turns silver in the winter light. I am not without grief. I am not without love for the daughter who hurt me, and I suspect I never will be. But I am, finally, without fear. And if you've been sitting with your own silence, your own kitchen, your own person you've been too afraid to hold accountable, I need you to know that the other side is real. I'm standing in it. What would you have done in my place? Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and if this story moved you, please leave a like. It helps me keep bringing you more. There are other stories on the screens that I think you'll want to hear. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I'll be here. Until next time.